Welcome to Joshua's story. This is the second presentation in this series, and in this presentation we're looking at the initial crossing. Joshua's story, the initial crossing. In the first presentation we saw how the people of Israel had travelled north. They'd conquered the land to the east of the River Jordan, and they'd set up their base camp at a place called Shittim. Now they were faced with an obstacle to reach the west bank. They had to cross the River Jordan. And the first fortress that was going to meet them was the fortress of Jericho. They needed to find out what was going on. So Joshua sent out spies to find out what faced them. 2 spies were sent across the river. But their presence was detected by the ruler in Jericho, and they were rescued by a local innkeeper called Rahab. The reputation of the Israelites and their military successes had spread before them, and the people of the land were well aware that there was a force waiting to take over the land. Rahab knew this, and she hid the spies and then told lies to the authorities so that the spies could escape. But she extracted a promise from them for the safety of herself and her family when Jericho was conquered. The spies set 2 conditions. Herself and her family, they all had to be gathered in her house, and the house had to be identified by a scarlet cord so that people would know that that house was not to be attacked. Then she arranged for the men to be lowered from her house, which was set into the town wall, and they escaped. They hid for a few days and then made their way back across the Jordan to report back. You can see from the map that the land is really quite small, the scale at the bottom, 100 kilometres. The communities in the land were scattered, some in fortified cities, some in small communities. The people of Israel had to take the land and move across the Jordan to do it. Let's look at Rahab just for a moment. She ran an inn that was built into the town wall in Jericho. The real problem is this: was she an innkeeper, or was she a prostitute, or was she both? The problem is in the Hebrew that the word for innkeeper and the word for prostitute are somewhat similar. We find she's referred to as a prostitute in the translation we've got in Joshua. And we also find she's referred to as a prostitute in the New Testament. But that doesn't mean very much, because the New Testament was based on the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And the Hebrew word has been translated by a Greek word, which means a prostitute. In fact, the Jewish historian Josephus in the 1st century described her as an innkeeper, and that seems to be much more likely. And the Targum Jonathan, which is an Aramaic translation of Old Testament scriptures, that also recognised Rahab as being a kind of hostess or an innkeeper. The fact is, we simply don't know. Nothing is made of the fact she's a prostitute anywhere else in the Bible. So perhaps it's better to think of her as an innkeeper, but we simply don't know. Here are 3 New Testament references to Rahab. In Matthew chapter 1, she's traced in the genealogy which led to King David. Now, we don't know for certain that's the same Rahab, but because she's not identified any other way, the probability is that it is. In Hebrews, the writer quite clearly says, by faith the prostitute Rahab. Now that's just using the word prostitute, the word from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. By faith the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed by those who were disobedient. Notice the word faith. Hebrews stresses the faith of this lady, not the fact that she was a prostitute or otherwise. James, the brother of the Lord Jesus, wrote that in his letter. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous? Righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction. James is applauding the behavior of Rahab. So these are the New Testament references to Rahab, but we simply don't know for certain. But we do know that's what she said to the spies. I know that the Lord has given this land to you, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts sank, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. The stories of what was happening to the Israelite people had spread far and wide, and Rahab, as an innkeeper with travellers coming to and fro, had heard of it. But the important thing was she recognized its significance. She recognized that the victories were being brought about because the Lord of the Israelites, the Lord your God, is God in heaven above and on the earth below. He is the sovereign Lord who made everything and holds everything in being. She recognized who God was. She took God seriously, and that influenced the way she acted when she rescued the spies and got them out of the fortress and away in safety. And in the process, in due course, she rescued herself and her family from destruction. That's the emphasis in the Bible. A woman of faith who saw who God was, took it seriously, and acting accordingly. Too often we make faith a kind of intellectual activity. It isn't. The word in the Hebrew and the Greek doesn't carry that meaning. Here's my attempt to capture its meaning: taking God seriously and acting accordingly. That's nothing to do with intellectual faith. Taking God seriously and acting accordingly. That's what Rahab did, and if you look at the book of Hebrews and the list of all the heroes of faith, that's what they all did. It's a beautiful picture of faith. Let's go back to our map. The base camp at Shittim, they had to cross that river Jordan. That was the task, crossing the Jordan. It was an obstacle in the way, and there was no way round it. The trouble was it was in full flood. Getting one or two fit men across was one thing. Getting a whole people group with women and children and possessions, totally impossible. If they'd waited till the flood had subsided, which would happen in a few months, it was still no use, because the crossing points would be guarded, and they still wouldn't get across. There was instructions given. The people had to follow the ark, the symbol of God's presence in their midst. The ark was just a wooden box that was gold covered. It had rings at the side through which poles could be passed, and it could be carried by the Jewish priests. So the presence of God, the symbol of the presence of God, was carried before the people. And the Levites, carrying the ark, stood in the water at the edge of the river. And the water flow stopped. It's described as being blocked off upstream, and it gives an idea where it is upstream, several miles upstream. This whole area is a rift valley. It's highly volcanic. Landslips occur. And that was almost certainly what happened. But as they stood in the water, the flow stopped. The timing was miraculous. And they carried the ark across to the centre of the river, to a bit of the land that was dry. And then 12 men, each escorted across the 12 tribes. Then they gathered 12 large stones and took them across to the west bank to make a memorial cairn. And then the ark completed the journey across. At that point, the water flow restarted. As the backing up of the water at the landslip further upstream, the water broke through and the water flow started in the river. And the people set up a camp, their base camp, at a place called Gilgal. Now, in fact, Gilgal may not be a place name because the word just simply means a circle or a fortified camp. So it just may mean a general description of a fortified camp. And that's where they set it up. That was the crossing to get into the west bank of the Promised Land. Can you imagine the impact? The impact on the people. Their first direct experience of this massive intervention of God on their behalf. A river stopping its flow so they all got across. But the word soon spread around in the local population. The Israelites have come across. God has helped them. Now the impact can be seen in many directions. So for example, the Lord said to Joshua himself, "Today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel, so that they may know that I am with you as I was with Moses." The people remembered Moses, that great leader, and all the things that Moses had done in obedience to God and how God had stood with him. Now this is the first time it's happened to Joshua. That day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they stood in awe of him all the days of his life, just as they had stood in awe of Moses. God had demonstrated that God was with Joshua. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you, till you had crossed over. The Lord God, your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. Words to the people. And what about the local people? Now, when all the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings along the coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan before the Israelites until they had crossed over, their hearts melted in fear, and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites. Yes, it had an impact on Joshua, on the way he was seen by the people, an impact on the people, but also an impact on the local opposition. Miracles do that. God is seen by his actions. We don't have to theorize about God. We can see God by what he does, and they say something about his person, something about his nature, and something about his power. Let's just expand that very slightly. God is seen and understood by what he does. He said he would take the people across the Jordan. He did it. And all that Joshua had to do was to follow the instructions. Those who align with that plan are vindicated and validated. Joshua followed the instructions of God, the plan of God, and Joshua's status before the people was raised high, and the reputation of the God of Israel spread around the people, because Joshua and the people had aligned themselves with what God was going to do. God's miraculous interventions do have an impact. They reveal his power. They reveal his faithfulness, his nature, and they reveal something about his purposes and his person. When miracles do occur, most people are amazed. But most of the local population didn't respond to God. They were scared, they were amazed, they were staggered, but they didn't respond to God. They didn't seek a better way. And that's always the way with miracles. When God intervenes miraculously in our midst, and he does it far more often than we realize, people may be amazed, but it doesn't generate faith or response in people in general. But it does encourage God's people, and it validates and vindicates all we stand for. That's what makes Rahab so unusual. That's why she stands out. She had seen the significance of what had happened. God confirms leadership, the leadership of Joshua. He confirms spiritual authority of Joshua with the miraculous. In general, people don't respond. But Rahab did. And in the end of the day, it saved her life and the life of her family. Joshua says that to the people. This is how you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites, selection of people groups that lived in the land. Here's the evidence. He's taken you across this major obstacle, the river. Miraculously, he did it. He's standing with you. He will see this through. So faith levels start to rise in the people. God said he would drive out the people. God said he would give them the land. But the people had to align themselves with God's purposes. They had to take action. Oh, how often we don't take that third step. There is no use sitting around in prayer meetings forever. Prayer is wonderful, prayer is great, prayer is essential. Listening to God is vitally important. But in the end of the day, we've got to align ourselves with God's purposes and take action. Do something. We obey God's direction. We get up, and in a sense, we answer our own prayers. Yes, God wins the battles, but we've got to act in alignment with his purposes for the battles to be won. We picture this in terms of spiritual warfare. Spiritual warfare, taking territory from the evil one for Jesus. It's God's warfare. He does it. We don't have either the power, the strength, or the ability to do it. It's God's warfare. But in his purposes, we have to do it. We have to align with God's purposes and obey his directions, and we'll see the battles being won. There's a wonderful picture for us here. They had to step into the river, that group of Levites carrying the ark, before they could get across the water, before God came in with his miraculous drying up the river. There was preparation for crossing, and that's so important. And sometimes preparation takes self-sacrifice. Spiritual preparation, but they had to pack up the camp. They had to be ready to move. They had to be ready to carry their stuff. But they had to follow what God was saying. It was an impossible obstacle. There's a picture. Only when the flow was held up had they any chance of getting across. And God had to do that for them. but they had to be ready to do it. And at the far side, they had to remember that God does the miracles. It's the Lord that brings success. Not tactics, not strategies, it's the Lord. All we have to do is to align ourselves with what He is doing and obey and act. Let's look at it in the context of spiritual warfare. There's a challenge for us here. Are we ready for spiritual warfare? Because if we're not ready, we'll be picked off. It takes tough preparation, self-sacrifice. But at the end of the day, success depends on following Him and His instructions. Not ahead of Him, not sitting around waiting for Him to act. We have got to act in His timing, as He directs. And in the end of the day, the battles are won by God's miraculous intervention. It's the wonderful way in which God works, and He still works that way in the whole of life today. I mean, to bring our lives into line with that kind of thinking. Our activities don't achieve things, but equally we've got to be ready to act. And when He shows us, we've got to be ready to move, to follow His presence, and be ready to step into the river for the miracle to happen. We've seen these cairns on the hillside in various places, set up for various purposes, sometimes with plaques on them, sometimes not. They were told to set up a memorial cairn with the 12 large stones that had been removed from the bed of the river. In those days, people in general couldn't read or write. Here was a physical, tangible present, a reminder of what God had done. This wonderful great miracle that had brought them into the land. And Joshua said that. He did this, that's the miracle, so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. Fear means reverence or respect, not terror. That's why the miracle happened. God is all powerful. God is on our side to act for us. And we have that reverence and respect for Him. That we might remember, and that all the people might know, and that we might be encouraged. I'm sure Joshua was greatly encouraged. This huge vindication and validation of all he stood for. It's tough becoming a leader when you follow a legendary leader like Moses. Joshua needed that encouragement. So did the people. That God was with them. He would not let them down. He would see them through. We move to chapter 5, where there's a series of events. 4 are listed here, and a 5th one I'll touch upon in a moment. The picture here of fear gripping the enemy. Put yourself in their shoes. They'd heard about this rabble of a people coming out of the desert, and they were scared. They felt they could deal with them. But they'd heard about the God of this people who'd done the most amazing things, made them uneasy. And now they hear about the God of the Israelite people who had brought them across the River Jordan, dry. Fear grips the enemy. And then a very strange thing, all the men of Israel are circumcised. Come back to that in a moment. And the Passover celebrated. The Passover, the feast that celebrated the release of the people from slavery in Egypt. And at this point, the manna supply stopped, because the people now had access to the food that grew in the land. They didn't need the supernatural manna supply. That's part of the impact of God's miracles, and it's important. When there are miracles, it sets the enemy on edge. This one's difficult to understand. Why did the men need to be circumcised? Circumcision was introduced in the time of Abraham, and it marked out and identified the people who were the descendants of Abraham. Normally it would be carried out on young boys in the first few days of life, typically on the 8th day. Painful, but it didn't last too long when they were that age. For men to be circumcised, removing the foreskin from their penises, that would be incredibly painful. There were no anesthetics, no antibiotics, and they used stone knives to do it with. And it would take the men a week, maybe 2 weeks, to recover after it. I can't explain why. Medically, circumcision has no advantage or disadvantage, with one exception, but it's a very modern one. It reduces the transmission of AIDS. But that didn't exist then. Just why this had to take place, I'm not sure. But I've put it down as the pain of identification, because what it did for all these men who were the warriors, to be identified as God people, there was involved in this considerable pain. And maybe there's something in that. That's more straightforward. A glorious reminder of God's release from slavery in Egypt. That was an amazing miracle in its own right. The memory of God's release. So they celebrated the Passover. That was the beginning of the long route that led the nation and the descendants of the nation to enter the land of Israel. Now they had the provision of the land. They didn't need supernatural food supplies. So these 4 themes are touched upon in this chapter. Crossing the Jordan, they hadn't fought a battle yet on the West Bank. This was just the start point, crossing the Jordan. Then the warriors were circumcised. The Passover was celebrated. And the 5th one I just touch upon, we'll deal with it later. God reveals himself directly to Joshua. They crossed the Jordan, and that involved absolute obedience. God's presence, symbolized by the ark, was central. They had to follow God's presence. And this made the impossible become possible. Crossing that river could be up to 2 meters deep in flood. It made the impossible become possible. The identity of the people of God confirmed and identified as one of God's people can be painful. And the memory, followed by the eating of the produce of the land. It's only God who rescues, or has rescued. It's God that does it. And the Passover celebration reminded the people of that. And Joshua is a human leader, with all the frailties of human leadership. Now he faces the Lord, the divine leader. And it's a recognition that this is God's battle. It's God's land. And human leadership needs to recognize that. And we'll expand that a bit more later. Bringing this together, this is just the crossing before any battles start on the West Bank. This is just the beginning. The impossible becomes possible because of a miracle. The reminder that it's God's land. In fact, everything in this world is God's. If you like, we are tenants. And God would drive out the people in the land, a people whose behavior was absolutely atrocious. And the role of the people of Israel was simply this: align with God's purposes and then act in obedience. The land would only be taken by the Israelites. God would have a purpose. God would make it possible, but they had to carry it out. God wins the battles, but he requires our obedience. And the leadership in this is so critical. And Joshua needed to be supported and encouraged because he was following the famous Moses as leader. And it's so important in this that leaders listen and obey and do it as God directs, and that together we remember God did it. And then miracles. Yes, they do encourage us. Wonderful. They encourage leaders. But in general, they don't generate faith in those who will not believe. That's the picture of the initial crossing, the starter point of the conquest of the land. In the next presentation, we're going to look at a mixture of success and failure in Joshua's story.